Today I want to talk to y'all about verbs in Irish, specifically present tense verbs, but a little bit of verbs in general as well. So first of all, what's a verb? A verb is a word that expresses action or a state of being, like run, jump, feel, or be. So in Irish, you're usually going to have to change the word in some way before you can use it. So for example, the word ri, which means to run. Well, that's called the verb root. When you look up a verb in your Irish dictionary, that's the word that's going to be presented. But it doesn't necessarily mean we can just use it as is and then like tack on who's running. We have to change it. So in the example below that, you can see we changed it to rihim, which means I run. We added a suffix to it, and it changed the meaning of the word into like a usable form. But it's not always that straightforward. As a matter of fact, most of the time, we can't jump straight from the verb root to a usable form. Sometimes we have to change the verb root into what's called a verb stem, and then from the stem, add the suffix to our final form. So I've got the little like illustration down there to show what I mean by that. So we've got the verb lay, to read. That's the verb root. In this particular case, the verb stem would be lay, just L-E fada, and then the final form lame, which means I read. So the verb stem is basically like a transition phase between the verb root and the final form. Now, before we actually get started like conjugating some verbs and learning the rules of that, we have to talk about one more topic, and that is the concept of broad verbs and slender verbs. Sometimes in Irish, you have to know the difference between what a broad verb is and a slender verb is in order to conjugate and to know what suffix to tack on the end so that you can use the verb. A broad verb is any verb whose final vowel in its stem is A, O, or U. So let's take, for example, the verb saoil, which means to save. Its stem is formed by dropping the I right before the L, and the final vowel then becomes A fada, a broad vowel, which makes it a broad verb. So a slender verb, on the other hand, is a verb whose final vowel in its stem is E or I. So let's take the word acme, for example, which means to classify. Its stem is A-I-C-M, like acum, and the last vowel in that is an I, making it a slender verb. Now let's start looking at some rules for actually conjugating Irish verbs in the present tense. There's two main groups. There are two main groups. First conjugation verbs and second conjugation verbs, and they follow two different patterns. First conjugation verbs, generally speaking, are just going to have one syllable. Second conjugation verbs, generally speaking, are going to have two. Today I only want to look at first conjugation verbs because it'll just be too long of a video to do both, and then I'll do a part 2 video for second conjugation verbs. So in the first conjugation verb group, there's some subgroups, and each of those forms their present tense in a slightly different way, using a slightly different pattern, but it's all pretty much the same, like they're similar. Okay, so the first subgroup of first conjugation verbs includes basic run-of-the-mill one-syllable verbs, such as re, which means to run, and alp, which means to devour. Also in that same subgroup are two-syllable verbs where there's a fada in the second syllable. A fada is just one of those accent marks you see sometimes over vowels. Those words with the fada in the second syllable are the only subgroup that breaks the rule about first conjugation verbs are generally one syllable and second conjugation are two. Next we have the subgroup of words that end with a fada, o fada, u fada, eo, or ua plus igh. For example, lay, which means to don, cloy, which means to tame, and buoy, which means to win. Now, those kind of seem like two-syllable words, but they're really not. It's more of like a diphthongy thing. So like buoy, cloy, but it's not flat out like buoy because that'd be yellow. But anyway, okay. The next subgroup are verbs that end with e fada plus igh, such as lay, to read. And lastly, we have one-syllable words that end with igh that don't fall into the previous two categories before them, so they don't have e fada, a fada, o fada, those things, such as knee, to wash. So now we can jump. Ooh, that's bouncing. So now we can actually start conjugating. The first subgroup included the one-syllable words, basic one-syllable words that don't fall into any other category, like re and op. With those, there's no change from verb root to verb stem. So there's not like a transition phase. You just tack the suffix right onto it. Also in this group were the two-syllable words with the fada in the second syllable, such as sowl. With these ones, you do have to change the verb root into a stem, and you're going to do that by dropping the final I in the second syllable. So sowl turns to sowl without an I, and then you can tack your suffix on at the end of that. There are exceptions to all these rules, mostly coming from the 11 irregular verbs, which I'll get to at some other point. But one specific exception that is not irregular is the verb chumwan, which means to drive. It is a first conjugation verb. It does belong to this group, and it does take these suffixes, but it differs from sowl, for example, in that it does not drop its I to form a stem. You leave it as is, and then put the suffixes on the end. Okay, now let's look at some of these suffixes. Once you've determined if it's a broad or a slender verb, you can pick which suffix to add on to the end to say what you want to say. One quick thing to remember is that if your subject is something other than a personal pronoun, like I've been focusing on in this video, like the dog, the tree, Lorna Lou, the verb is going to take the suffix of he, she, they for any particular verb group. So, for example, Lorna Lou runs would be rihin Lorna Lou. Okay, I have I, you, he, she, we, y'all, and they. So I'm just going to go down the columns here. If your verb is broad and you want to say I do something, then you tack on AIM. If it's slender, it's just I am. If you do something, it's ANN plus 2. If it's slender, it's EANN plus 2. Now notice for the I verbs, we don't add a pronoun. Like to say I run, saying rihim may would be redundant. You don't need a pronoun to say I. Or we, just I or we, yeah. For he, it would be ANN shay if it's a broad verb, EANN shay if it's a slender verb. She, ANN she if it's broad, EANN she if it's slender. For we, AIMID if it's broad, and just IMID if it's slender. So for example with that one, like we run, that's slender, so it would be rehimage. Alp, we devour, would be alpamage. For y'all, it would be ANN shiv if it's broad, and EANN shiv if it's slender. And for they, it would be ANN shid if it's broad, and EANN shid if it's slender. So let's just do a few to kind of like get it in our heads, whatever. Sowl. Now we form the stem, drop the I, sowl, the last vowel is broad, so it's a broad verb. So I save would be sowlum, she saves, sowlin she, we save, sowlamage, sowlamage. Now let's look at the subcategory that ends with a fada, o fada, u fada, eo, ua plus igh. So to form the stem for this subgroup, all you have to do is drop the IGH. That's your stem. So cloy, the stem for that would be clo. Now for these, you'll notice there's not like separate endings for broad or slender. You just follow this pattern. And it just so happens that all of these verbs are going to be broad anyway. But anyway, so I, you, he, she, we, all, they. I, you add I am at the end. You add in to. He, in she, in she. We, I am, I, D, y'all, in shiv. And they, in shid. So buoy, to win. I win would be buim, buim. We win, buimage, buimage. He wins, buinshe. Alright, now we've got the subgroup that ends with e fada plus igh. Kind of like with the last group, you form the stem by just dropping igh. And then whatever you're left with, that's the stem. For example, lay, to read. We drop the igh, we're left with le fada, and that's our stem, and then we tack on the endings. Still, you don't have to have a separate category for broad endings and slender suffixes. These will always be slender, it just so happens, but it doesn't matter, you just tack on the ending. The suffix for I do something is im. The suffix for you is ann2. He, ann she, ann she. We, imid. Y'all, ann shiv. And they, ann shid. So let's do a couple again. So I read layim. You read layin to. He reads layin she. We read layimage. Our last subgroup are the ones that end with igh but don't have those other qualifications such as e fada, a fada, o fada, ua, whatever. Yeah, ua. So, for example, ni, which means to wash. Again, you form the stem by just removing the igh. So all we'd be left with ni is just in. And then you add the suffix to the n. So I, you'd add I fada im. Now, unlike the other ones where you'd kind of pronounce it im, this is going to be more like im, like a long e sound. You, I fada onn2. It sound like in2. He, I fada onn she. She, I fada onn she. We, I fada mid. Y'all, I fada onn shiv. And they, I fada onn shid. So let's take ni for example. They wash. Nien, shid. We wash. Neemage, I wash. Neem. That's about all you need to know to conjugate first conjugation present tense verbs, except for one more thing, and that is when you use the present tense in a question, the verb's going to take an uru. Uru is the Irish word for eclipses, and you need to go back and watch my video on eclipses if you haven't, and that'll explain what I'm about to talk about. So, for example, you win, buintu. But if you ask, do you win, it would be nmuintu. Because M is the buddy letter for B, if you remember. So we tack that on the front, it takes over the sound. We leave the B to remember what the original verb was, but we don't pronounce the B. Nmuintu, do you win? But remember, L, N, R, S, and vowels never take an uru. So, for example, layin to, you read. Unlayin to, do you read? It doesn't change at all. Now, negative statements are going to trigger shave it. What this thing is bouncing? Which is just the Irish word for lenition, which I happen to also make a handy-dandy video about in the past. And so you can watch that if you haven't, and it'll explain it a lot more. So, for example, if we had clone she, he tames, but ni clone she, he doesn't tame. We added an H after that initial consonant C, and it changed the sound from K to H. But L, N, R, and vowels never take a shevu. So, for example, if you had Nian She, he washes. Nian She, he doesn't wash. That verb doesn't change at all because it starts with an N. And I think that's it. If you're watching this on Instagram, if you liked this video, please follow me and like it. And if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe and give it a thumbs up. And if you found these notes to be helpful, I'll be posting them to my Instagram, so feel free to check that out. And I'll see you next time. Chief Mirabal Shiv.